In the autumn of 1998, an automotive mechanic walked into a hardware store in Mississauga, Ontario, looking for a replacement combination wrench. For 60 years, that specific retail rack had held heavy, drop-forged steel stamped with a familiar name, manufactured just 15 kilometers away in Brampton. But the rack had changed. The thick Canadian steel was gone. In its place hung rows of high-gloss, blister-packed wrenches manufactured overseas. They cost exactly one-third the price of the domestic tool. The local hardware aisle had quietly evicted its hometown wrench. The paradox was that the Brampton factory had not closed. Its drop hammers were still falling. Its dies were still shaping alloy steel. A decade earlier, that same brand had commanded the retail shelf, the garage wall, and the farm workshop. The company had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the brutal consolidation of the Canadian hand tool industry. Yet at the peak of the modern retail boom, the Canadian consumer was suddenly disconnected from the Canadian toolmaker. The wrench had not failed. The market had simply decided that the everyday buyer no longer required domestic steel. But the real story of Grey Tools in Canada is not about a factory shutting its doors, because those doors remain open. It is the story of domestic manufacturing versus big box retail, of drop-forged permanence versus the private label price tag. It is the story of the Canadian hardware market's relentless pivot toward cheap imported steel and exactly what it costs to keep a professional Canadian hand tool alive when the consumer shelves demanded surrender. Somewhere in a toolbox, in a factory drawer, in a hardware aisle, there is a stamped handle with a name and a Canadian story behind it. We tell those stories. Subscribe if you want to hear them. The story begins not in a distant overseas forge, but in Canada, in the rapid industrial expansion of Toronto in 1912. In 1912, the streets of Toronto were loud with a new kind of mechanical violence. The era of the horse-drawn carriage was rapidly closing, and the combustion engine was taking its place. It was a transition that created an immediate, desperate crisis in the workshops, carriage houses, and early garages scattered across Ontario. The machines were evolving. The hand tools required to fix them were not. Alex Gray, a young man who had spent his early career as a traveling hardware salesman, observed this crisis firsthand. He spent his days moving between the agricultural towns of rural Ontario and the booming industrial quarters of the city. He watched blacksmiths attempt to repair early automobiles using tools designed for repairing plows. He watched mechanics struggle with the primitive fasteners of the era. The hardware trade was changing, but the supply lines were entirely fractured. Before Alex Gray established his company, a Canadian mechanic faced a miserable choice when outfitting a toolbox. They could use traditional agricultural tools made of cast iron poured into a mold, which is brittle and snaps under heavy torque. These thick, clumsy tools were meant for heavy wagon bolts, not for the delicate, tightly packed fasteners of a modern internal combustion engine. They slipped. They rounded off nuts. They turned minor engine repairs into expensive, catastrophic failures. The alternative was to purchase precision tools imported from the United States or Sheffield, England. These imported wrenches possessed the correct tolerances, but they carried staggering tariffs and import duties. A Canadian mechanic, farmer, or early factory worker could not buy a dedicated, reliable, domestically forged automotive wrench at a fair price. The Canadian tool market simply did not have the manufacturing infrastructure to support the new mechanical age. Alex Gray recognized the void. He understood that a nation preparing to build and drive thousands of automobiles could not rely on foreign steel to keep them running. In 1912, he founded Grey Tools in Toronto. The company initially began as a distributor, sourcing reliable equipment for the growing automotive trade. But distribution was only a temporary solution to a permanent problem. To truly serve the Canadian mechanic, the tools had to be made on Canadian soil, shaped for Canadian hands, and priced for Canadian wages. The operation evolved into Gray forgings and stampings. The company invested in drop forging, a process where heated metal is shaped by heavy dies, striking it into form. This was not the gentle tap of a blacksmith's hammer. This was industrial violence. Massive gravity hammers slammed down onto glowing steel blanks, forcing the metal into precision dies. This process aligned the grain structure of the steel, making it incredibly strong and resistant to spreading under pressure. The Canadian entry of Gray's forged wrenches did not happen through massive consumer retail chains, which did not yet exist. It happened through specialized industrial supply channels. One of the earliest major avenues for Gray's tools was the A.R. Williams Machinery Company in downtown Toronto, a massive distributor of industrial equipment. Placing tools in an industrial catalog rather than a general store was a deliberate strategy. It meant the wrenches were placed directly into the hands of professional machinists, millwrights, and mechanics. It bypassed the casual consumer entirely. The economic proposition was revolutionary for the domestic market. In the early 1920s, a domestically produced Gray open-end wrench was introduced to the market at roughly $0.60, approximately $9 in today's money. At a time when imported American mechanics tools could cost a substantial fraction of a day's wages, this pricing changed the calculus of the Canadian workshop. It was not a disposable bargain tool. It was a professional-grade instrument priced so that a working mechanic could afford to build a complete set over time. The Canadian trade press quickly recognized the shift. By 1924, publications like Canadian Motorist began reflecting the reality that crude agricultural implements were no longer acceptable in an automotive service bay. They urged mechanics to adopt precision-forged automotive toolkits to service the increasingly complex vehicles rolling out of factories in Windsor and Oshawa. The Gray wrench, with its tight tolerances and hardened jaws, answered that exact call. The expansion was methodical and relentless. Records suggest that by 1928, Gray drop-forged tools were stocked by over 150 independent auto supply houses, hardware counters, and industrial suppliers from Windsor to Montreal. The tools moved out of Toronto on railcars. They found their way into the repair bays of the early Ford assembly plants. They were purchased by regional logging operations in the Ottawa Valley that needed reliable tools to repair their steam donkeys and early trucks. Every wrench shipped carried the physical stamp of its origins. The name on the steel was not an importer's mark. It was the manufacturer's guarantee. The mechanic, the machinist, and the factory worker all depended on the same stamped steel. Gray had solved the Canadian mechanic's most fundamental problem. They had taken the high-cost, high-precision wrench out of the realm of expensive foreign imports and placed it securely on the Canadian workbench. But forging a good tool was only the beginning. To conquer the vast, unforgiving geography of Canadian industry, the wrench needed a design breakthrough that would make it not just affordable, but indispensable. The tool that changed the Canadian mechanical landscape was not a complex, motorized invention. It was a single piece of carefully engineered steel. By the late 1930s, the automotive and industrial machinery operating in Canada had evolved. Engine compartments were becoming crowded. Fasteners were smaller, tighter, and subjected to immense heat and vibration. The crude, thick-jawed tools of the previous decade could no longer physically reach the bolts they were meant to turn. Gray tools answered this mechanical bottleneck with a perfectly executed design: the alloy steel combination wrench. To understand what this tool felt like to a mechanic of the era, you have to look closely at the steel. A combination wrench, a wrench with an open end on one side and a box end on the other, was a revelation in efficiency. The mechanic could use the open end, a wrench with a U-shaped opening that slides onto two sides of a fastener, to quickly run a loose nut down a threaded shaft. Then they could flip the tool in their hand and use the box end, a wrench with a closed ring that surrounds more sides of a fastener, reducing the chance of slipping, to apply massive, final torque without destroying the bolt head. Gray manufactured these wrenches using alloy steel mixed with elements such as chromium, vanadium, or molybdenum to improve strength, toughness, or wear resistance. Before this, many cheap tools were made from unalloyed carbon steel, which had to be forged thick to avoid snapping. Gray's alloy steel allowed the wrench to be drop-forged incredibly thin. A mechanic could slide the narrow profile of a Gray box-end wrench into the lightless, grease-covered recesses of a Ford V8 engine block, knowing the tool would fit. The precision was absolute. Gray engineered their tools with an obsessive focus on tolerance. The allowed variation in a tool's dimensions. Tight tolerance helps a tool fit a fastener accurately. If a wrench jaw is even a fraction of a millimeter too wide, It will bite into the corners of a hex bolt instead of the flat sides. Under heavy pressure, those corners will shear off. In a busy shop, a rounded bolt meant the repair suddenly required a blowtorch, a drill, and hours of unpaid, agonizing labor. Gray's tight tolerances prevented that nightmare. This reliability came with a specific economic calculation. In 1938, a standard Gray alloy combination wrench cost roughly $115, approximately $22 in today's money. At that time, a premium American imported wrench of similar quality could easily cost over $2, heavily inflated by cross-border tariffs. An average Canadian garage mechanic earned perhaps $25 a week during the late Depression years. Spending over $1 on a single wrench was a serious capital investment, but a cheap inferior wrench that spread its jaws on a frozen manifold bolt cost far more in lost shop time. The Canadian mechanic did not buy the Gray wrench because it was cheap. They bought it because it was an insurance policy. The true Canadian distribution breakthrough arrived not through a retail catalog, but through the grim necessity of the Second World War. When Canadian industry mobilized for wartime production, the government needed tools that would not shatter under continuous, punishing use. In 1940, Gray tools became a critical supplier for the Department of Munitions and Supply. This changed everything. The wartime contracts acted as a massive, subsidized trial run across the entire nation. Gray tools were thrust into the hands of thousands of young men and women. They were used to assemble Lancaster bombers at the de Havilland Canada aircraft plant in Toronto. They were thrown into the metal toolboxes of military mechanics servicing trucks overseas. They were heavily stocked by Cochrane Dunlop Hardware, a massive industrial wholesaler that pushed the wrenches deep into Ontario's mining and forestry camps. They were standard issue in the maintenance yards of the Canadian Pacific Railway. They tightened the bolts on agricultural equipment, rolling off the Massey Harris tractor lines. This exposure built an impenetrable Canadian moat. Competitors could not easily replicate what Gray had achieved. A foreign company could manufacture a wrench, but they could not match Gray's proximity to the Canadian industrial buyer. A cheap domestic competitor could undercut the price, but they could not replicate the precise heat treatment, controlled heating and cooling used to change the hardness, toughness, and strength of steel that allowed a Gray wrench to survive an 8-hour factory shift without deforming. The brand became embedded in the mechanical infrastructure of the country. By the late 1940s, industry estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of Gray wrenches were in active circulation. The company had expanded its dealer network to over 500 industrial supply houses, automotive parts jobbers, and regional hardware distributors. When a young Canadian finished a vocational apprenticeship and bought their first professional tool set, the choice had already been made by the generation before them. The jaw held, the bolt turned, the job continued. The name stamped into the handle was not a country of origin, it was a specification. By the 1960s, the Canadian industrial landscape had entered a golden era of mechanical expansion, and Gray Tools was positioned exactly at its center. The transition from wartime production to the post-war consumer boom created an unprecedented demand for reliable, professional-grade hand tools. The country was building highways, erecting skyscrapers, and buying automobiles at a staggering rate. The tools required to maintain this massive infrastructure could not afford to fail. Gray wrenches became the undisputed standard across the Canadian professional ecosystem. They were not merely present, they were entrenched in the daily operations of the nation's heaviest industries. General Motors mechanics used them on the assembly lines in Oshawa. Maintenance crews carried them through the massive Stelco steel mills in Hamilton. They were standard issue in the TTC streetcar repair yards in Toronto. Heavy-duty mechanics dragged them through the mud of McMillan-Bloedel logging camps in British Columbia. They tightened pipe fittings deep underground in the Inco nickel mines of Sudbury. Instructors at the Ryerson Institute of Technology trade schools demanded them on student benches. Across the prairies, independent automotive parts jobbers proudly stocked the heavy red and white metal display boards that signaled a shop was serious about its hardware. Ontario mechanics used it in repair bays. Factory maintenance departments bought it by the drawer. Hardware counters gave it credibility. The cultural moment that defined Gray's dominance was the rise of the independent Canadian service station. Before the era of computerized diagnostics and sealed engine components, The local garage was a theater of physical labor. A mechanic in 1965 diagnosed an engine by sound, feel, and experience, relying entirely on their hands and the steel they gripped. This was an environment where a broken tool was not an inconvenience, it was a severe economic penalty. A mechanic bought their own tools, and they bought them for life. This environment created the ultimate proving ground for domestic manufacturing. On a frozen exhaust manifold bolt inside a drafty Manitoba service bay in February, where a cheap jaw would round the flats and turn 10 minutes into an hour, the gray wrench's grip could mean the difference between finishing the repair and losing the bay for the day. Mechanics demanded the tools because they trusted the forging. Retailers expanded their stock because the tools rarely came back broken. Factories standardized their tool cribs around the brand to eliminate the downtime caused by shattered sockets and snapped handles. To solidify this absolute trust, Gray heavily promoted a lifetime warranty. The makers promised to replace or repair a tool if it fails under specified use. In the context of the 1960s Canadian market, this was not a marketing gimmick. It was a solemn pact between the manufacturer in Brampton and the mechanic in Winnipeg. If a wrench somehow spread or snapped, the dealer replaced it over the counter, no questions asked. The warranty desk opened cases with the confidence that their metallurgical processes were practically flawless. This promise built an ironclad loyalty among professional tradesmen. The lifetime warranty built absolute trust in 1968, but the company could not know that the retail systems defining that trust would radically change over the next 3 decades. The tool itself became an object of quiet beauty under the harsh fluorescent lights of a shop. Gray had mastered chrome plating, a thin metal coating used to resist corrosion and create a polished finish. A well-used gray combination wrench felt balanced, heavy, and smooth in the hand. The chrome resisted the corrosive mix of motor oil, road salt, and brake fluid that coated every surface of a Canadian winter garage. When a mechanic opened a heavy steel toolbox drawer, the gleam of perfectly arranged, domestically forged wrenches signaled professional competence. By 1970, industry estimates suggest Gray was producing millions of individual hand tools annually. They were the undisputed kings of the Canadian professional drawer, holding a market share that foreign competitors could only envy. They had conquered the workshop, the factory, and the service bay. But the seeds of their retail displacement were already taking root in the hardware aisles they thought they controlled. At the height of its power in the mid-1970s, the Brampton manufacturing facility was a fortress of Canadian metallurgy. The plant consumed tons of raw alloy steel weekly, transforming cold rods into precision instruments through the deafening, rhythmic concussion of the drop hammers. Gray tools had expanded their lines far beyond basic wrenches, forging complex ratchets, heavy-duty pipe tools, and specialized industrial socket sets. The scale of their Canadian distribution was staggering. By 1975, industry records indicate that Gray tools were carried by over 1,000 active distributors from coast to coast. They were prominently featured in the heavy, grease-stained catalogs of industrial supply giants like Acklands and Brafasco. They were proudly stocked by regional hardware chains like Home Hardware and local independent automotive jobbers. For a brief, shining period, Gray was not just a tool for the professional mechanic, it was the premium upgrade for the serious consumer. If a Canadian farmer in Saskatchewan needed to overhaul a combine harvester before the autumn freeze, they drove to town and bought a Gray wrench. If a millwright in Quebec needed a tool that could survive the violent vibration of a massive paper roller, they requisitioned a Gray wrench. If a young automotive apprentice in Nova Scotia wanted to prove they were serious about the trade, they saved 2 weeks' pay and bought a Gray socket set. The farm shop, the factory floor, the apprentice bench. Under the bright lights of a local Canadian hardware store, a Gray retail display was an imposing piece of merchandising. Heavy metal pegboards held perfectly spaced rows of gleaming chrome. The tools were not hidden behind cheap plastic blister packs or locked in anti-theft cases. They hung heavy and accessible on steel hooks, inviting a buyer to take them down, feel the knurl, a textured pattern cut into metal to improve grip or adjustability, on the ratchet handles and weigh the solid steel in their palm. Peak Canadian orders during this era ran into the tens of millions of dollars annually. The Brampton plant employed hundreds of Canadian workers, paying manufacturing wages that supported families, bought homes, and helped build the middle class of Ontario's industrial belt. The Gray name was an institution woven so tightly into the physical infrastructure of Canadian industry that its permanence seemed unquestionable. But the retail hardware aisle is not a museum. It is a merciless battleground of margins. And while Gray had spent half a century mastering the art of forging steel, a new generation of Canadian retail executives was about to master the art of the private label. The decline of Gray tools in the Canadian consumer market is not a story of compromised steel or failed engineering. It is the story of a domestic manufacturer colliding with the brutal realities of modern commerce. The retreat of the Canadian wrench from the everyday hardware shelf was driven by three structural realities. Force 1, Canadian retail and dealer dominance. Force 3, competition from cheap imports and private labels. And Force 5, steel, labor, warranty, and distribution costs. The Canadian turning point arrived in the late 1980s. The hardware landscape across the country underwent a violent, irreversible shift. For decades, Gray had relied on a vast network of independent hardware stores, regional automotive jobbers, and industrial supply counters. These were businesses operated by people who understood the physical difference between drop-forged alloy steel and cheap cast metal. But these independent retailers were systematically being driven out of business or absorbed by massive, high-volume, big-box retail chains. These new retail empires, most notably Canadian Tire, realized a fundamental truth about the modern consumer market. They did not need to sell a tool engineered to survive an industrial assembly line. They only needed to sell a tool that was good enough for the suburban homeowner standing in the aisle. This realization unleashed the era of the private label. A product made by one manufacturer and sold under another retailer's brand name. Retailers began contracting directly with massive, high-volume overseas tool factories, primarily in Taiwan and later in mainland China, to produce lines of hand tools stamped with the store's own branding. In Canada, the Mastercraft line became the dominant force in this new retail economy. The competitive displacement was devastating. The cost differential between a domestic wrench and an imported private label tool was a chasm that no amount of brand loyalty could bridge. A Gray combination wrench, drop-forged in Brampton, required premium North American alloy steel, skilled unionized Canadian labor, strict environmental compliance for its chrome plating facilities, and local distribution overhead. In 1992, a single premium Gray combination wrench might retail for $18, roughly $34 today. Beside it on the shelf, a nearly identical-looking imported private label wrench could be sold for $5. For the professional mechanic working a 10-hour shift in a heavy-duty truck bay, the difference in quality was obvious. The imported wrench often featured softer steel, looser tolerances, and a thicker profile that could not fit into tight engine compartments. But the professional mechanic no longer controlled the retail volume. The market was now dictated by the weekend DIY mechanic, the casual homeowner, and the budget-conscious tradesman. For those buyers, the imported tool was heavily chrome-plated, it fit the bolt reasonably well, and the price was undeniably attractive. The low-cost tool did not need to be better, it only needed to be good enough. This price gap broke the historic link between the Canadian toolmaker and the Canadian consumer. When national hardware chains analyzed their floor space, the mathematics were undeniable. A pegboard of private label tools offered massive retail margins, frequent turnover, and satisfied 90% of casual buyers. A pegboard of Gray wrenches required a high retail price, yielded a slim margin for the store, and was only demanded by a shrinking pool of traditional professionals. The retail chains made the obvious financial decision. The retreat was methodical and silent. Throughout the 1990s, Gray tools was systematically pushed out of the mass consumer market. The heavy red and white metal display boards disappeared from the front aisles of general hardware stores in Ontario. They were moved to the back walls, then to the locked contractor cases, and finally they were removed entirely. The everyday Canadian consumer lost access to the Canadian wrench. If a young apprentice walked into a standard hardware store in Vancouver, Winnipeg, or Halifax, they could no longer find the Brampton-made tools their fathers had used. The shelves changed names. The pricing dropped. The origin moved overseas. Gray Tools faced a terrifying choice. They could attempt to compete on price by closing the Brampton forging plant, firing their Canadian workforce, and importing cheap steel under their own name, destroying 80 years of metallurgical reputation. Or they could abandon the mass retail shelf entirely and retreat behind the walls of industrial procurement. They chose the factory. But surviving that choice would require abandoning the garage entirely. To survive the retail slaughter of the 1990s, Gray Tools made a calculated, necessary retreat. They surrendered the everyday Canadian garage to the private labels and fortified their position where cheap imported steel was still a liability rather than a bargain. The heavy industrial sector, government procurement, and the military. This retreat was dictated by Force 5, steel, labor, warranty, and distribution costs. Running a drop forge in Brampton, Ontario at the turn of the 21st century was an expensive proposition. The price of premium North American alloy steel fluctuated wildly. Unionized manufacturing wages, reflecting the high cost of living in the Greater Toronto Area, could not be compressed to match the pennies per hour wages of outsourced overseas production. Furthermore, distributing heavy steel across a country with the geography of Canada was financially punishing. Shipping a crate of drop forge wrenches from Ontario to a logging camp supply depot in northern British Columbia required significant logistical overhead. The lifetime warranty, once the ultimate symbol of Canadian manufacturing pride, became an enormous financial weight. Big box retailers offering private label tools also offered lifetime replacement, but their economic model was entirely different. Because an imported Mastercraft wrench cost the retailer almost nothing to acquire, replacing a broken one at the customer service desk was practically free. For Gray, replacing a meticulously forged, heat-treated, chrome-plated domestic tool meant absorbing a real manufacturing loss. Faced with these crushing realities, the company stopped trying to compete for the homeowner's weekend toolkit. They stopped fighting for placement on the pegboards of general hardware stores. Instead, they focused entirely on the professional buyers who still understood that a broken tool cost more than a premium price tag. Gray Tools were sold through dedicated industrial distributors like Ackland's Granger. They won massive procurement contracts with the Department of National Defense, outfitting Canadian Armed Forces mechanics. They supplied the maintenance crews of national airlines, the heavy equipment operators in the Alberta oil sands, and the specialized manufacturing plants that required absolute metallurgical certainty. They became the invisible giant of Canadian toolmaking. A mechanic working on a billion-dollar naval vessel in Halifax held a Gray wrench. But the teenager buying their first tool set at a local strip mall in Calgary had no idea the company even existed. This survival strategy saved the Brampton factory, but it fundamentally altered the brand's place in Canadian culture. The wrench was no longer a shared national experience. It became a specialized elite instrument, priced far beyond the reach of the casual buyer. By the early 2000s, purchasing a new, complete set of Gray combination wrenches required a serious commercial account or a deliberate, expensive special order. The everyday Canadian worker was now permanently separated from the everyday Canadian tool. The market had spoken, and it had demanded cheap replacement over permanent repair. The retail chains had won. The heavy red and white displays were gone for good. The connection was broken. The hardware aisles shifted. The local jobbers vanished. The catalogs changed names. The prices dropped. The imported steel took over. The Brampton plant faded from view. The consumer shelf went quiet. The Canadian garage drawer closed. Unlike many of the great Canadian manufacturing empires that were completely dismantled by the end of the 20th century, the Gray Tools story does not end with a bankruptcy filing or an abandoned factory. The brand did not die. It was not absorbed by a massive foreign conglomerate, nor was its name sold off to be stamped onto inferior overseas steel. Gray Tools survived. Today, they remain the only industrial-grade manufacturer of hand tools left in Canada. But their survival required a permanent withdrawal from the public square. They exist now as a specialized, elite instrument, serving government contracts, heavy industrial sectors, and the military. The company secured its future, but the everyday Canadian hardware market lost its domestic standard. Because new gray wrenches are largely absent from consumer retail shelves and carry a premium industrial price tag, a fierce, dedicated preservation community has emerged across Canada. The secondary market, the network of estate sales, used equipment dealers, and private collectors where older goods are traded, is remarkably active. In rural Ontario, swap meets, in the dusty aisles of agricultural antique shows in Alberta, and on specialized Canadian machinist forums, vintage gray wrenches are heavily hunted. Tool collectors, retired factory workers, and younger mechanics scour these channels looking for the heavy, perfectly balanced tools forged in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. They do not buy them to display behind glass. A young mechanic in a modern independent garage will gladly pay $30 or $40 for a single, heavily used gray combination wrench from 1968, precisely because they intend to use it every day. The original still matters in Canada for a concrete, physical reason that modern big box retail cannot replicate. Consider a rusted seized suspension bolt on a 20-year-old pickup truck enduring another brutal Saskatchewan winter. An imported private label wrench, stamped from softer steel to save manufacturing costs, will imperceptibly flex under heavy torque. Its jaw will spread, it will slip off the fastener, and it will round the corners of the bolt. An old gray combination wrench with its tight jaw, properly hardened steel, and honest wear can still do what a loose bargain bin copy cannot: grip a frozen fastener without destroying it. The mechanic trusts the vintage Canadian steel because the job still begins where steel meets steel. The physical site of this survival stands exactly where it has stood for decades. In Brampton, Ontario, at 299 Orenda Road, the Gray Tools manufacturing plant remains fully operational, but the industrial landscape surrounding it has radically transformed. The region that was once the beating heart of Canadian domestic manufacturing is now largely populated by logistics hubs, massive warehousing centers, and distribution facilities for goods manufactured on the other side of the planet. Amidst this ocean of imported commerce, the heavy drop hammers inside the Gray facility still fall. The ground still shakes. The plant is a solitary, stubborn fortress of domestic metallurgy, turning raw steel into professional instruments just as it did when the automotive boom first began. There is a remarkable surprise footnote to this enduring legacy. Because Gray Tools never compromised their manufacturing process and never abandoned their lifetime warranty, the company still honors the guarantee on tools they forged half a century ago. If a retired millwright walks into an authorized industrial distributor in Canada today holding a cracked gray socket from 1974, the company will replace it. The warranty was never a marketing tactic for a disposable era. It was a structural promise, and incredibly, the company that made the promise is still there to keep it. The story of the Canadian wrench reveals a difficult truth about the national commercial culture. For decades, the Canadian worker demanded tools that reflected the harsh, unforgiving nature of the country's geography and industry. We valued steel, we valued craftsmanship, we valued the ability to repair a machine rather than replace it. But when the retail market offered the illusion of that capability at a fraction of the cost, the mass consumer abandoned the domestic forge. The Canadian market rewarded price over permanence, shelf space over metallurgy, and outsourcing over local wages. We traded a work culture built on generational reliability for an economy of disposable convenience. Yet somewhere in a damp, unheated garage in rural Nova Scotia, a heavy alloy combination wrench from the 1960s still sits in the top drawer of a dented red toolbox, its chrome worn thin by decades of motor oil and freezing hands. Its old Canadian name stamped deep into the handle, still waiting for a bolt, a heavy pull, and one more turn. See you in the next one.